Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Molly Silberberg, and I run BAM's Humanities Programming. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight marks the close of our 17th season of Eat, Drink, and Be Literary. Over the years, it's been a joy to come together to celebrate the work and careers of some of today's leading literary voices. While we had to postpone most of last season's programming, we're grateful to, at long last, be able to welcome Luis Alberto Urrea to BAM and to Eat, Drink, and Be Literary. It's a pleasure as well to welcome back longtime series moderator Deborah Treisman. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the land that I am on today and on which BAM's physical buildings are located, which is the unceded land of the Lenape people. I acknowledge Indigenous stewardship of this land and honor the Lenape elders, past and present, as well as future generations. A few notes on tonight's program. In our Zoom webinar tonight, our speakers will be visible and audible, but audience members will not be. Tonight's program includes closed captioning, which you can turn on by clicking the CC button on the bottom of your screen. Many thanks to Gina for captioning this evening and for making tonight's program more accessible. Our friends at Greenlight Bookstore have created an Eat, Drink, and Be Literary reading list where you can purchase all of this season's authors' books, which we'll be posting a link to in the chat. We will have time for questions towards the end of the discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A module, which is also located on the bottom of your screen. This series has always been made possible with the help of sponsors and partners. I'd like to thank our season sponsor, Bloomberg Philanthropies. To all of BAM's members and patrons, thank you as well for your continued support. Thanks to Great Performances, BAM's in-house caterer, for sharing recipes for a series of specialty cocktails with zero-proof versions, just for the virtual season for us to enjoy from wherever we're tuning in from tonight. And it is a great joy to partner and co-curate the program with my colleagues at the National Book Foundation. Throughout the year, they host a range of incredible programs that help bring great literature to a wide range of audiences across the country. I'm going to turn the virtual stage over to my colleague, Natalie Green, Public Programs Manager at the National Book Foundation, who will tell you more about this evening's program.
Thank you so much, Molly, and thank you to the whole BAM team for their 17-year-long partnership on the series. I'm Natalie Green, the Public Programs Manager at the National Book Foundation, and I'm thrilled to join you for the season finale of Eat, Drink, and Be Literary alongside Brooklyn Academy of Music and our bookseller, Greenlight Bookstores. Tonight, we're honored to celebrate the work of poet, novelist, and essayist, Luis Alberto Urrea. The mission of the National Book Foundation, best known as the presenter of the National Book Awards, is to celebrate the best literature in America. Through public programs and our education access initiatives, we work year-round to reach readers everywhere. Over the past few years, we visited 40 states and donated 1.6 million books to children and families living in public housing communities. We've also expanded the reach of our book donations and national partnerships to college students and readers inside of prisons and detention centers. If you're able to, please consider donating to fuel this work, which makes events and partnerships like this one possible. For tonight's program, I'll introduce our longtime series moderator, Deborah Treisman, who will in turn introduce Luis. Luis will read from his work, and then Deborah will return to our virtual stage to chat with Luis before we open up to a few questions from the audience. And now I'm delighted to welcome Deborah Treisman, the fiction editor at The New Yorker. She's the host of that publication's award-winning fiction podcast, the editor of the anthology 20 Under 40 Stories from The New Yorker, and the recipient of the 2012 Maxwell Perkins Award for Distinguished Contribution to Fiction. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Natalie. Continuing our series of introductions, it is my pleasure to welcome Luis Alberto Urrea, whose name I cannot pronounce quite as beautifully as Molly did. A member of the Latino Literature Hall of Fame and a Pulitzer finalist for his nonfiction book, The Devil's Highway, Luis Alberto Urrea is also the author of 4 volumes of poetry, 2 short story collections, 2 memoirs, and 5 novels, including The Hummingbird's Daughter and most recently, The House of Broken Angels, which was published in 2018 and which the Washington Post called a big, sprawling, messy, sexy, raucous house party of a book, a pan-generational family saga with an enormous bounding heart, a poetic delivery, and plenty of swagger. Urrea has many subjects, many genres, and many approaches, but at the center of almost everything he writes, or at least has written so far, is a place, the border between the United States and Mexico. Fraught, sometimes terrifying, sometimes beautiful, and even sometimes, as we'll hear tonight, funny territory in which people can live or die, get lost or lose themselves, and sometimes find themselves. Please welcome Luis Alberto Urrea.
Thank you, Deborah. Buenas tardes, New York. Tijuana in the house. I'm so happy to be here with you. So happy to talk with you at last. I was going to do this a year ago before the plague hit, so it's really nice to be back with you. And thank you to BAM for their tireless work and efforts. And thank you to the team tonight. It's been really lovely being here. I feel honored. I don't know if you took, the name of the evening literally, but we have Malbec in my house. So salud. And I'll tell you a little bit about the piece I'm going to share. It's from House of Broken Angels. And it is a raucous novel, I'll admit, but it's a tragic novel in a lot of ways. And there's a moment near the ending of the book that readers seem to like a lot. And it's a chapter called Parrots, pericos, parrots. And so I want to shorten it a little bit for you, but give it to you. And I like to do it from memory because it seems more alive that way. So that's what I'm going to do. The setup is this. It's near the end of the novel. It's about 2 brothers. If you don't know the book, one of them is dying, and they need a moment of levity, and they have a memory of something that happened with a parrot. And this is what happened. Now, so it's about Big Angel and Little Angel. Their father used the name twice because he'd forgotten he used it once before. Father has left them in Mexico and married an American woman. And so he thinks that what's important is for the big brother to take the little brother to Tijuana as often as he can, his stepbrother. And they have to go once a month and pick up the original mother, the grandmother of everybody. And off they go. Big Angel drove very carefully. He drove that old Rambler with one hand, cigarette out the window, exhausted. Ever since he'd gotten his green card, all he seemed to do was work. Americans work around the clock. There was no time for fun. He had his little brother in the back seat who was busy reading Batman comic books and famous monsters of Filmland magazines. And he thought, this kid is hopeless. They got to the neighborhood, Colonia Independencia, and they headed up the road to Grandma's house. It was unpaved, full of boulders and sharp rocks, and Big Angel had to drive very slowly because if you hit one of those rocks, it could tear the oil pan out of the bottom of your car. He got all the way up to the top of the hill, and there it was, Grandma's yellow house perched on the edge of the slope. In the front of the house was a 6-foot-high cement wall that his grandfather had once built when he was still alive, and embedded in the top of the wall were shattered Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola bottles, points up to stop any bandidos who might want to come in and steal Grandma's underwear, perhaps. They pulled up to the gate, got out of the car, opened the big wooden doorway, stepped up to the house door, opened it. There was no sign of Mama anywhere. They stepped into the lobby and waited. She was surely in her bedroom behind the closed door packing. They looked to the side because there, as always, was the family parrot. He was named Periquito, little parrot. But they had given him a more formal name. He had their last name. He was Periquito Garcia de la Cruz. And he sat inside the cage for hours every day. Out of boredom, the brothers thought they would rescue him, and they put a mirror in the cage to see what he would do. And now he had become an insane egomaniac, and he would spend his hours eyeing himself in the mirror, back and forth, and muttering his name to himself, challenging that reflected parrot to a fight. Periquito, 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 Periquito. Then he would calm down. Periquito, 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 Periquito. Big Angel looked over there and said, "Parrot, that drives me crazy, man." The door opened, Mama came out. She had her little shoulder bag and she had her red purse, and she stood with them regarding the parrot, and she said, "Ay, mira el perico." "Sí, Mama," said Big Angel. "Give me your bag. Vamos, gotta get back. Border wait is awfully long." She said, "Mijo, I told you once before, if you want to make money, you will smuggle pericos into San Diego, because the poor Mexicanos in San Diego don't have parrots. You cannot be a Mexican without a green parrot, mijo." He said, "Mama, I told you 100 times, it's illegal. No se permite. You can't take parrots into San Diego. I'm sorry." They walked out. Perhaps they should have listened when she said, as they went out the door, "We'll see." They got in the car. They headed back down the rampa very slowly. And Mama said, "Mijo, I would like to go to the fruit market before we go to the border." "Yes." He knew better than to argue with his mother anymore. He said, "Mama, lo que sea." He drove them to the fruit market. Instead of going west, they went east. And they arrived at this famous spot that had been selling fruit since the 20s and 30s. A square, a quadrangle of old buildings. In the middle was a parking lot full of trucks laden with watermelons, sugar canes, potatoes, onions, mangoes from Sinaloa. The blacktop was shellacked with decades of juice of tomatoes and fruits worked into the blacktop by trucks. Big Angel found a spot to park, and he parked, and he got out and opened the door for his mother, who got out of the car and took her pocketbook and headed off like a battleship straight through all the trucks. Little Angel got out and looked up at his brother, and his brother shrugged. "I don't know," he said. They followed her. To their horror, they saw that she was heading for a little corner market that said bird seller. Little Angel said, "Are we in trouble?" Big Angel said, "We'll find out." They followed her to the bird seller. She set her pocketbook on the workbench, and she called for the young man inside. "Joven, joven, por favor, venga para acá." "Sí, señora," he said. "How are you?" I'm fine. Do you have green parrots?" And he said, "Sí, señora, claro que sí." "Mm-hmm. I would like to see your most tame hand-raised parrot." "Oh, see, I'll go get it." He went inside, and he came back out with a little green parrot on his finger. It was indeed tame, happily looking about at everything. And Mama went into that crazy grandma voice that Mexican grandmothers use on babies, on puppies, on kittens, perhaps on parrots. "Ay, mi periquito! Uy, qué bonito el periquito!" The two boys were looking at her like, what is going on? And, "Ay, qué bonito el periquito! Ándale, párese aquí, párese aquí." And she'd move him from finger to finger. And she said to the young man, "This is a very tame parrot. Good work." "Thank you, señora." She said, just a moment." And she reached down to her pocketbook and clicked it open. The boys watched. The bird seller watched. She reached in and she took out a bottle. set it down on the workbench. It had a little eyedropper on top. She unscrewed it with one hand while with the parrot, and she lifted up the eyedropper and she held it above the parrot's head. It looked up at it and she tapped his beak. She said, "Ándale, abre el piquito, abre el piquito, no sea malo, abre, abre." He opened his mouth and she squeezed 3 drops into it, put it back, screwed it back onto the bottle. And she looked at her boys and said, "Es tequila." And they all waited. And the parrot began to sway. It looked around and swayed and then suddenly fell over backward off her hand, and she caught it. And she reached into her famous pocketbook and took out a sheet of the newspaper. And she laid the parrot asleep on his back, snoring, making little parrot snores on the paper. And she rolled it up. She rolled it up so that it formed a cone, the tail down in the thin part, the head lolling at the top. He looked like a parrot-flavored ice cream cone. And then she appalled everybody there by pulling open the top of her dress and taking the parrot and inserting him down the front of her dress, pointy part down, all the way down, shoved him down with her thumb, adjusted herself and said to the boys, "Let's go to San Diego." Well, Big Angel thought he was going to go to the penitentiary. Little Angel in the back seat was completely terrified. They drove extremely carefully to the kiosk at the border crossing. Back in those days, it wasn't high tech. The border crossing then was a bunch of plywood kiosks with a bar stool and an agent sitting inside. And they pulled up to the kiosk and they sat there idling as the agent looked in at them. Had a military haircut, big red American face. He stood up, adjusted his gun belt. Big Angel rolled down his window. The guy looked in, said, "Amigo, ¿tiene papeles?" "Sí," Angel said, "green card." "All right, buddy." He looked in at Mama. "Señora, ¿tiene usted papeles?" "Sí, visa." He looked in the back at Little Angel, said, "How about you, buddy?" "I'm a U.S. citizen." "All right." The guy stood up and went into the second part of the ritual, which happened to every car leaving Tijuana. He said, "Amigo, ¿tiene usted licores en el trunco del carro?" Every driver denied it. Over 50% had trunks full of liquor. Big Angel said, "No, just my mother." "That's all right, man." And he began to turn away. He began to look at the next car. He was raising his hand to signal the next car to come forward. And at that moment, when everyone in the car thought, "We've made it," the parrot awoke. Before he had turned in full profile came the cry. He looked back into the car. He bent down, stared into the vehicle. The parrot horribly began to climb out of the dress, everything moving by itself. Mama looked down, looked at the agent and said, "Isn't this interesting?" Everybody frozen in horror. Years later, 10 years after this, Little Angel went to a movie that always reminded him of his grandmother. It was called Alien, because the bird, screaming and squawking, climbed out and stuck its head out of the top of her dress. And she said, "I don't even know what's happening," and burst out into the car, flew circles around the inside of the car, screaming and squawking, green feathers falling. The agent outside watching it go around and around. And Mama didn't even flinch. She smiled at the agent and rolled down her window. And the parrot escaped. And in that moment, US federal agent, grandmother, two brothers, all became one in unity as they together watched the parrot enter the United States illegally. That's it. I'm done. Salud.
So I wish we could hear the audience laughing.
Maybe they're laughing.
It took so long to introduce you because you're a memoirist, you're a journalist, you're an essayist, you're a novelist, you're a poet, and now I think I have to add performer. So I'm wondering, do all of those things spring from the same place in you when you write? Is it all the same impulse regardless of the form?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's it's writing. And that was always, not always really, but when it hit hard. And, this may be of interest to people, maybe not, but my mom was from New York. She wasn't Mexican. She was from Richmond Village on Staten Island. And the family had a place up in Mattituck on Long Island. And she was a Manhattanite and all that stuff going on. And I've got to tell you, sounds pandering, but it's not. Ever since I was a little boy, once we got out of Tijuana and moved to San Diego, there was one thing that came every week that my mother held on to like the gospel itself, and that was the New Yorker. Every week. I grew up, I will confess, looking at the cartoons.
As you should.
But yeah, exactly. As you should. So, it was a very literary thing. My mother was a big reader, quite brilliant. My father was learning English. He was memorizing the dictionary 5 pages a week to get better at English. And words were really important in our world. And, I think I just loved them. And it was all of a piece to me. It was all the same thing. I felt like my dad was a blue collar man, not by choice, but by immigration. And my mother, I think, was ashamed of it. She was not. But, I learned from him that a worker has to know the tools, right? I didn't know you specialized. I thought, I want to be a writer. I better try this stuff. I was lazy, so I followed delight. But
yeah. Well, when you are starting on a project, I'm thinking of your book Devil's Highway, which is a reported book about a group of Mexican immigrants who got lost in the desert in Arizona. And then looking at your novels, The Hummingbird's Daughter and Queen of America, which take a real story and of your great aunt, I think, and fictionalize it. I'm wondering why not fictionalize the first? Why fictionalize the second? What guides you? Is it how much you can actually know and report for real, or is it something else?
To me, fiction is the highest. Or fiction and poetry wrestle in my mind, but the closest. I think secretly I wanted to be a musician. My family, the Mexican side of my family, are musicians, all of them, one form or another. And I always confess this to students, but now students, they're a lot younger than me, so they don't get it. But I think I wanted to be Robert Plant in Led Zeppelin, and that wasn't going to happen. So the closest thing I can come to composing a symphony or something, to me, is a novel. And so The Hummingbird's Daughter, began as folk tales in Tijuana. I hear it from my aunt. I had an aunt we called Tia Flaca, Aunt Skinny, sort of blind in one eye from glaucoma and diabetes and, chain smoking, and had those cat-eyed glasses with glitter in the frame. And she'd tell me these stories, outrageous stories about everything. And amongst them were these stories about my Yaqui aunt, who was some kind of witch, some kind of healer. She could raise the dead, And then as I was getting to adolescence, I think her yarn spinning got out of control, and she started telling me, she could fly too. And that's when I thought, give me a break. But she's been with me since I was 6, maybe. And so I found out that she really did exist. And so just to know her, I researched it for many, 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 many years. And I didn't know if I was going to write about her or not. I didn't feel like I had the right to write about her. But I ended up researching her for 25 years to write. And I tried to rely on women writers to spell me on this. Nobody wanted to do it for me. They said, no, it's your responsibility. So that's how that happened. And The Devil's Highway, you may appreciate this, but the writing career, the old cliche about the roller coaster, and mine was one of those fancy ones that went straight down and disappeared underground, and it was okay. But Little Brown contacted me, and I thought, what? Little Brown? What in the world? That was like being visited by the gods, in my opinion. I was in my office. I was teaching here in Chicago. And I called my editor. It was Jeff Chandler at the time. He wasn't my editor. He was just this guy. And he said, do you know about this event? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, you want to write about it? And I said, no, I don't. I said, why not? And I said, Jeff, I've done 3 nonfiction books about the border. I've done a novel about the border. Most of my poetry's been, I didn't sign up to be border boy. And I think I've said all I can say about it. He said, okay. We are Little Brown. I said, no, I know. What I didn't want to say is I was scared of the Border Patrol too. But I told him, I think the responsibility for all those deaths is too much for me. And he said, okay, but I have one editorial question for you. And I said, yeah, what? And he said, do you trust anybody else to write this book? And I said, hell no. He said, hey, right? And so he gave me carte blanche to do whatever I needed to do, which was beautiful, and I was happy that I had written some nonfiction books, but I was never a reporter. I was writing participatory essays, experiential essays, personal. My wife, who's actually running the computer over to the side here and sharing Malbec, she's a reporter, lifelong Gannett survivor. And so she kind of coached me in a lot of the more journalistic parts of it.
Right. And now, do you think you're fully settled on writing novels, or do you think you could still go back the other way?
I do a lot of essay stuff, and it shows up. I had a piece about the election in the Atlantic, and this month's the 20th anniversary of those deaths. And I'm thinking about doing a piece for a magazine. So I could put together a couple of books now of sort of collected essay work. I used to be a columnist for Orion, and I did some of my happiest nonfiction for them for a while. So there's quite a library built up. But yeah, if a nonfiction major project showed up, and I think it tries to a lot, I probably would do it. But I've got some novel craziness in me. I haven't worked it out yet.
So the House of Broken Angels is also based on nonfiction, based on somewhat on your family life. When you take your family life, say, and metamorphose it into fiction, how much do you change? How do you decide what becomes fiction and what stays true to your life?
It depends. For example, with Hummingbird's Daughter, after all those years of research, the 2 books, I had I had the skeleton of history, but because she had been forgotten, I was resurrecting her. And the not to get too new agey about it, but one of the things that happened, which I should have known would happen, because in the tradition she comes from, she's not gone. She died in 1906, but she's very present to them. And so as soon as the work began, medicine people, shamans, curanderas, spellcasters, all this stuff started happening. And so I ended up with this matrix of things that were revelatory to me. And so I knew that if I had the history, I would follow the history. You know, she didn't live long. She died at 33. And her whereabouts, you know. For example, when she lived in New York on East 28th, I found her place is still there. It's a Kinko on East 28th. Yeah, and she would go to, you know, the collegiate church over there, Norman Vincent Peale's church, I guess. It was amazing to know that she was always this far away, no matter what I did. So that's one thing. House of Broken Angels, you know, I wanted to write truly a symphony. And I know people, I think, mistake it for another book that they think that I wrote, but the intent is very serious. And the rhythms and the melodies are this is going to sound really pretentious, so forgive me, but this is true. I had in mind Respighi's The Fountains of Rome, because of the structure and the insane energy and joy and sorrow, and then the coda at the end when the whole orchestra keeps going down steps into silence with a church bell tolling. And I thought, that's the structure. So it's not all Led Zeppelin. And it was about my brother's death. And there was a moment, it's in the novel, and understand it's a novel. A lot of the things in it, of course, didn't happen. But when my brother really did have his final birthday party about a week before he died of cancer. And he was very weak, and he was in bed during the party often. And he called for me, and I went down there, and he told me to get in bed with him, which was unbelievably awkward. He was not a hugger or anything. And so the whole book came from that moment of lying in bed with him several times during the day. And then, you know, being a Mexican family, they were like, Tio Luis is in bed with Pops, let's go. These pile-ups, you know, of siblings or grandkids, or, you know, this wonderful array of people in bed with him. And he was so happy. And the last thing that happened that I think made the book happen ultimately was, as we were leaving, you know, I was on tour constantly, and I was leaving his party the next day to go to Flagstaff and then to Dallas. And my family, my wife and daughter anyway, of the family that we had come together, they were coming back to Chicago. And I went into his bedroom. It was 10 or so at night. He was exhausted, and he stopped me and he said, "Don't say goodbye. Don't say goodbye to me." And I said, "Okay, what should I say to you?" And he said, "Tell me you'll see me next time." And so I said, "Okay," put my hand out, and he grabbed it and he pulled me down, and he said, "After I'm gone, if you see hummingbirds, that's me." And I said, "Okay, you know, don't cry in front of your brother." And I went, by the time I got to Dallas, he was gone, and I had to come back for the funeral. So, you know, those things haunt you. And in some ways, he represented this Mexican person that we don't think about. We have these cliches in our minds, you know, and this guy, my brother, really did run the computer system for the gas and electric company. You know, he was an American who spoke Spanish. He was an American who more or less believed in the Virgin of Guadalupe. but he'd been here 60 years, 70 years. So I wanted to tell that story. We have this this thing, I think, in the Latinx writing community, that people are getting tired of being minstrels of our misery. There are other things to talk about. So I just wanted to create a loving portrait of family and all of its madness,
And what you're working on now is a loving portrait of the non-Mexican side of the family, right?
Just wait. It is Godzilla. No. Yeah. My mom. So my mom was in the Red Cross. She was a war hero. She left New York City in 1943, trained with the Red Cross, and went to Europe. And she was in England for a while. She was based at a B-17 base. She was what they vernacularly call a donut dolly. U.S. Red Cross had a big 2.5-ton truck with a galley in the back with coffee makers and donut makers, and they put it on a ship and they landed on Utah Beach, she and her team of women, and they drove all the way across France, trailing Patton and his gang. And they ended up in the Siege of Bastogne. They ended up in the Battle of the Bulge. They made it through the Battle of the Bulge, went into Germany, got to Weimar, where they were making an officers' club, and then were told, you got to go up this mountain and liberate the camp. They didn't know what kind of camp it was. So she was also a Buchenwald liberator. It was mind-boggling. And after that, she suffered a hideous crash in the Alps, vehicle crash, and she was almost killed. And she spent weeks and weeks in a MASH tent, and then came home, and for the rest of her life had nightmares, which is, partially why I write. I always tell students, my house was a place of cries of despair late at night. So I was up all night with Leonard Cohen, and I started writing my notebook. But I thought, you never think about this. You never think about your mom being this mind-boggling superhero. It's one of the worst crimes we commit, I think, just thinking, my parents, man, they're so unhip.
Did she talk about it?
Huh? Yes. I'm sure you'll appreciate this. It seems like such a literary trope, but she had her war chest. She had her actual Army footlocker. It was painted green, had her name spray painted on it. Name was Phyllis. And she told me, don't ever look in there. Dear boy, she used to call me. If you could have seen, imagine my mom in the Mexican barrio, right? Always wore white gloves, always had a string of pearls, a black dress, a nice little pin, sometimes a hat, always gestured with her hand, yes, dear. I had to say, yes, mother, dear. I couldn't say, yeah. Can you imagine how well that went over with the homeboys in the barrio? Look at that little Irish looking dude saying, yes, mother, dear. But that was her. And she told me, dear boy, never open this trunk. It's my secret. It's like, no, Mom, I'll never do that. And of course, the first chance I got, I opened it up, and she had stuff in there. She had an army jacket. She had things she had pilfered from various Nazi places. And, it was fascinating until I opened what I didn't know was in there, which was her Buchenwald album. And there were pictures of, corpse and all that. And she wasn't happy that I had opened it, but it opened this communication with us that was amazing. And the thing she told me, which I've never forgotten, I was a little kid, but she said, dear boy, I had a camera, and I took those pictures until I got ashamed of myself for doing it. And I stopped. And she said, ever since, I've been ashamed of myself that I didn't take more. So, her life after the war was complicated. And and she met my dad in San Francisco, and some kind of weird romance. And I don't think she imagined that she was going to end up in Tijuana on that dirt street you just heard about my story. She told me, in fact, she thought she was going to some lovely hacienda. I imagined her thinking Anthony Quinn was going to be there, you know, and charros and stuff, but it didn't turn out that way.
So turning her life into a novel, what is that process for you? Are you imagining her, or are you imagining someone like her?
Yeah, that's a great question. I curse you for asking it, but listen, I wrote it 4 times and threw it away. My beloved agent is Julie Barrer. And Julie has been very patient with me for a very long time with this book. And I was trying to deal with the forgotten woman, you know, it was my mom. And Julie would pretty much say after every approach, yes, but World War II, Louise. I'd be like, World War II, yeah, and, you know, yes, but World War II. And I suddenly realized that it didn't have to be my mother. But the template of the journey that they undertook gave me the spine of the book. So yeah, it's about a woman sort of like my mom. I mean, I can see parts of my mom in her. But one of the miracles of this, because a lot of times weird secular miracles happen, you know, but during the research, again, the reporter, my beloved over here to the side, she was researching the other 2 women from the truck, and we assumed they were all deceased. And it turned out that the truck driver, my mom's best friend at that time, lived 2 hours from us.
Wow.
She was dead, 94 years old, and sent her a letter. She called us immediately, and she was hilarious. And she always called me Louis. This Louise thing was beyond her, Louis. And then she said to me, Louis, I can't wait to meet you, but don't try to wait till my 95th birthday, if you know what I mean. And I thought, I'm in love with her already. And we went down there, and she loved to have a Manhattan. She called it Joy Juice. And she'd start sipping the Manhattan and would immediately become sort of 38 years old and really saucy. And you know, we were close to her till she passed away this last year. So that was fantastic. You know, she died at 100, 101. So she was a fountain of information. My mother left behind tons of information, all of her journals, all of her little poems, all of her pictures. She even had a picture of old Adolf that she'd stolen out of some Nazi's desk. So I had all this stuff, and Miss Jill shared it all with us as well. And so it took shape. It took shape. But if I couldn't have found the distance, for example, try writing love scenes about your mom. No.
Right. It's another woman.
Yeah.
Just like your mom.
Yeah, just somebody else, not me. And you know, that moment, you may appreciate this. We're going through Miss Jill's photo albums, and there's pictures of my mom on the Riviera, looking like I'd never seen her looking so cute and young and beautiful. Whoa, look at mom. And all of a sudden, there's this tall, kind of semi-muscular dude in black trunks. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. And Miss Jill said, what is it? And I said, who's this guy? And she leaned over and she said, oh, that's Jake. Jake. And I said, Miss Jill, what are you saying? And she said, Louis, it was a war. We all had men. I thought, Mom. But you know, that vibe really turned me on. It really excited me, you know, that there's this forgotten force of heroes, women heroes who risked everything and were written out. You know, the Band of Brothers, they were there. Siege of Bastogne, those books, they were there, making donuts for people. Forgotten, not even footnoted.
Yeah. How strange is it to be writing about something that has nothing to do with the border?
It's awesome. Because you know what? There's nothing but borders. It's all borders. The border, the border, the Mexican border, it's just it's an image. It's a trope. It's it's a metaphor for all the things that keep us apart from each other. Look at the last 4 years. Good God Almighty. They didn't need a border fence because they were erecting fences everywhere between us. So my whole job, I feel, has been to just try to. I once said this, and I don't know if it's pretentious or not, but I really felt it, that we writers are writing little notes. Sometimes they're love notes, and we're folding them up and we're throwing them over a fence, hoping someone sees them. But I mean that in every way. Anyone who's paying attention can see border fences through every audience.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot more questions for you, but I think we need to take some of the audience questions.
Okay.
If
I'll have
we
some
run
help.
out, I'm coming back. So let me have a look at these. We have a question from somebody who saw you in January of 2020 in San Miguel, where you were teaching a workshop.
Yeah.
And she said at that time, we also had the opportunity to visit a nearby migrant shelter together. I would add to your resume, advocate for migrants. Can you talk a bit about how your writing, both literary and journalistic, has been informed by your deep empathy for the migrant experience?
Sure. Thank you for that. And we will see each other again in San Miguel. But, I've told this story before, but my dad died at the hands of Mexican police. And it was awful. And I won't go into it much. But, I was 19, maybe 20. In my senior year in college, first one to go to college, and those guys made me buy the corpse. They wouldn't give me the corpse. So that being said, that's shorthand. I was looking for something that would give my life some meaning. I wrote about it, of course, and that had some big effect in my life, having written about it. We can talk about that later if you feel like it. But I fell in with a group of relief workers in Tijuana because I thought, I'm going to go back to the hometown. I had no idea how rough it really was. And so I spent years in the Tijuana garbage dump with garbage pickers, children's prison. There's a children's penitentiary in Tijuana. And they have a giant cage in the middle where all the girls are put so they don't get raped by the inmates. Wow. Orphanages, school, whatever. And I was the translator, which transformed me in my thinking about being a writer, because I had the language to speak, but I realized that I also had the ears to hear. So the people would tell me their life stories, and then I would tell the Americans what was going on, and the Americans would, and I had to observe everything, help bury people and help medical exams and OB, pregnant women, examinations with American doctors. It was everything you can imagine, kind of Mad Maxy in some ways, because there's a lot of apocalypse. So from there, believe it or not, I was hired, hand of God perhaps, to teach expos at Harvard. And off I went. I honestly went from a ranch in Baja to Boston for the first time, thinking, I'm going to die, man. I had a John D. MacDonald novel, Elvis Costello records. And everything changed. But I realized that I wanted to bear witness. So I started writing about that stuff, and nobody would publish it. My first book was rejected for 10 years, which hardened my resolve instead of made me quit. I'm stubborn that way. And, people were saying really stupid things to me back then. You got to understand that was started in 1983. And, you know, a lot of New York editors were just like, what is this? So it was a long time, a lot of experience there. I'm still really involved with those folks. And I'm involved with people doing rescue. Weirdly, I ended up involved with Border Patrol because of the Devil's Highway. I have a supervisory agent, love him a lot. You know, so it's important to me. And when I hear anti-migrant rhetoric, because part of me, you know, has a religious background, I always want to ask those good Christians, have you ever looked at your Bible? Because you know, you're way off target on what you claim you are. So I just do, and I love that community. And yeah, the migrant shelter is just a brilliant place, led by a brilliant, forward-thinking pastor who attends to everybody. His church was mad at him because he was sheltering lesbians. He was sheltering, you know, gay couples. He was helping women who had been raped on the road to abort. But to me, that was sacred work. So I love him a lot. We're in touch with them, and we'll see. But yeah, I'll always do it.
Yeah. Now we have a question about how your stories come to be. If you start, for example, with an idea or a thought or an image, how do you decide which to stay with and develop, and what happens then to the others?
Right. The dreaded little black book, man. You know, I fill many journals with lots of things. You know, it's funny. I teach a lot of workshops, but students ask me that a lot, and I tell them, well, look, the text will tell you what it is if you just listen. You know, if I need to tell the story of a half indigenous, illegitimate young girl in Mexico who in her teens became known as the queen of an indigenous nation and fomented the Mexican, or helped foment the Mexican Revolution, is probably going to be, you know, some kind of James Michener kind of book, right? And then if you see morning dew on a sunflower, it's probably a haiku.
Right.
No, so you want to be flexible, and I'm just fascinated by it. I'm fascinated with how the world talks to us. I think it does. I guess I'm a little too mystical for my own good, but plus I read too much haiku. So,
well, now we have a question about what language the world is speaking. Do you have do you have works you've published first in Spanish? Do you ever translate your own work?
Yeah, I do. But you know, the funny thing to me is this: Hummingbird's Daughter, Queen of America, at least half of The Devil's Highway, most of House of Broken Angels, all of Into the Beautiful North, they happen in Spanish. It's already translated. I had to translate it into English while trying to find some way to make the prose in English feel like Spanish. So I was feeling pretty, you know, pat myself on the back about that until people started complaining that there weren't Spanish editions. And whenever the call for a translation happened, I was on the road. The first one was Hummingbird's Daughter, and San Francisco, God bless them, you know, they're very forward thinking, and they wanted to do my very first big read, but they had conditions. It had to be a paperback so people could afford it. So Hachette took that project over. It also had to be translated. And I thought, what? I'm flying to, and it was a short schedule. And I contacted my cousin in Sinaloa. Our family's really originally from Sinaloa. And he's an ambassador and a very good author himself. And I told him my woes, and he said, just send me the manuscript. I'll take some notes, and then we'll argue over it, and we'll just throw it together. I said, that's great. Not realizing that a career politician's a type A kind of guy. And he shipped me the whole thing in Spanish. And they paid him handsomely. He really liked it. It was part of his retirement fund. And I thought, thanks, man. I don't even have time to read it. Just go, go, go. So that's how that began. You know, and when things slow down a little bit, I would like to do my own, you know, revert back to Spanish, but stories in Spanish. I like to write poetry in Spanish. You know, you just adjust as you can go. But also, you know, once Hummingbird came out and he had retirement money, he would write to me and say, "When's our next book?"
And when you read that translation, did it still feel like your book?
No. Here's the thing. He's not a mystic. You know, he's a progressive, científico, intellectual, not religious. So it has a whole other vibe. But I thought, but she's his aunt. This was his chance to tell his version, trying to honor my vision of her. So it was very cool for me. I liked it. He also did Into the Beautiful North. And what's funny to me is that the Spanish speakers, because that one really got around to communities, they would tell me, "Oh, Luis, your Spanish original is so much better than that English version." That's thanks to my cousin. So, you know, it's fun, right? I think it's cool.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
How do you envision Mexican American and Chicano literature in the future? What do you want to see from writers? And can you speak of Tomas Rivera, who was so involved in community?
Tomas Rivera is one of the saints. Some of the old timers, you know, from Tomas Rivera, my beloved Rodolfo Anaya, you know, he was one of my early mentors. I think a whole new generation is moving in. You know, I'm a big fan, promoter, and believer of the young women writers that are out there right now. And it's not just, you know, the Chicanx. I'm getting used to the X part, but you know, the Latinas. You know, there are people from Colombia here. There are people who are Chicanas. There are Puerto Rican writers that are brilliant. You know, we're all here, and I think one of the values of our evolution is that we ourselves had borders. Boricua versus Mexican versus Cubano versus Dominican. Man, you got it right in New York, you know?
Yeah.
But I think we're realizing that that is a hindrance. Just in the Chicano movement, you know, you were Chicanos over in California, maybe in Arizona, but then you were Latino somewhere else, then you were Hispanics up in New Mexico, and you were Mexican Americans. And so we fought about those nomenclatures instead of, you know, celebrating and helping each other. And I think this era is the new era, and there's some awfully brilliant writers out there.
Well, thank you so much, Luis. This was great. I wish we had
you.
another hour.
Yeah, I can't believe I got to talk to you.
Luis, Deborah, thank you. This was such a beautiful evening. I really could have sat here for at least another hour and listened to you both. But for now, we will just say thank you. Thank you to everyone tuning in tonight. It's been a pleasure. Have a good rest of your evening, everybody.
Thank you.